Rise of the Nazi Party. The success of Hitler and the Nazi Party did not come from nowhere. The party developed and established itself in a Germany devastated by defeat in World War I and suffering an economic crisis. Anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, was present in societies across Europe, and there was a rise in pseudo-scientific ideas of eugenics and race theory. The newly established democratic government of Germany, the Weimar Republic, was under attack from other political groups. Right-wing extremists blamed the country's defeat in World War I on a conspiracy between communists and Jews. Timeline. 1918 – The end of World War I. The Weimar Republic is established as a new democratic government for Germany. 1919 – The Treaty of Versailles is signed. Germany is required to accept full responsibility for the war, and must pay reparations to cover all civilian damage caused by the war, amounting to $33 billion US dollars. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, abbreviated to Nazi, is established, combining right-wing nationalism with socialist economic ideas. Dominant themes in Nazi ideology were a racist and anti-Semitic German nationalism, fierce opposition to communism, rejection of liberal democratic government structures, and opposition to big business. 1921 – Adolf Hitler became party chairman. 1921–1922 Support for the Nazis grows due to the appeal to young unemployed men who were suffering due to the economic crisis under the Weimar Republic. 1922 Inspired by the Fascist Party in Italy, Hitler introduced the straight-arm salute, which became synonymous with the Nazi Party, and is still used by neo-Nazi and fascist groups today. 1923 The Nazi Party carried out an unsuccessful coup against the government which resulted in Hitler's arrest. He used his trial as a platform to talk about his Nazi ideologies, gaining much greater notoriety. Whilst in prison Hitler wrote his manifesto Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he outlined his ideology and violent anti-Semitism. 1925–1929 After his release from prison in 1924, Hitler announced that the party would take a legal path to power, and despite poor results in elections, support was developed. Mein Kampf was published in 1925. 1929 On the eve of the Great Depression, the Nazi Party had around 130,000 members. The Nazis gained support during the economic crisis by promoting the idea that Germany's problems were the fault of Jewish financiers, building on existing anti-Semitic sentiment. 1930 Nazi electoral support surged to 18% as traditional right-wing and centrist parties struggled to respond to spiraling unemployment and business failures. 1932 The Nazis became the largest party in the German parliament, winning over 37% of the vote. Stable government became impossible with the Nazi Party and the Communist Party both opposing the democratic constitution, and controlling over half the seats in parliament between them. A second election also proved inconclusive, though the Nazi majority was reduced. 1933. January, the traditional right-wing president, Paul von Hindenburg, was persuaded to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, German equivalent of Prime Minister, with a cabinet with a minority of Nazi ministers. Once in office, Hitler quickly secured almost unlimited power through manipulation and terror, though he remained publicly respectful to the president. February, when a fire destroyed the German parliament in February 1933, Hitler claimed the country faced a communist plot. He used the situation to justify an enabling act, which gave him dictatorial powers. March, the first concentration camp was set up in Dachau, southern Germany. Communists, Social Democrats, trade unionists, and other political opponents of the Nazi regime were imprisoned there. July, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party in Germany. 1934 In June 1934 Hitler ordered a ruthless purge of political rivals, resulting in the murder of over 80 individuals. This was primarily aimed at the Sturmabteilung, SA, the Nazis' paramilitary wing, which threatened the traditional German military, and which presented a potential alternative power structure to those loyal to Hitler. The defeat of the SA allowed Himmler's Schutzstaffel, SS, the Nazi paramilitary group most loyal to Hitler, to assert itself as the most powerful and feared organization in Nazi Germany. The Night of the Long Knives also targeted other political opponents such as left-wing Nazis and traditional conservatives, cementing Hitler's political dominance. When President Hindenburg died a couple of months later, Hitler proclaimed himself Führer, Supreme Leader of Germany. Europe's Roma and Sinti people, often labeled as gypsies, historically, were targeted by the Nazis for total destruction. 100,000 and 500,000 Roma and Sinti people were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. Many more were imprisoned, used as forced labor or subject to forced sterilization and medical experimentation. Roma and Sinti men, women and children were targeted for persecution and imprisonment, with a specific focus on clearing Berlin before the city hosted the Olympic Games in 1936. As World War II began, the genocide of the Roma and Sinti people intensified. Roma and Sinti people were deported to ghettos including Łódź and to concentration camps including Dachau, Mauthausen and Auschwitz-Birkenau, which had a specific so-called gypsy camp. On the 26th of February 1943, the first transport of Roma and Sinti men, women and children arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of the 23,000 Roma and Sinti people imprisoned within the camp, it is estimated that over 20,000 were murdered. On the 2nd of August 1944, the so-called gypsy camp at Auschwitz was liquidated. Thousands of Roma and Sinti people were murdered in the gas chambers and the remaining prisoners were deported to Buchenwald and Ravensbrück concentration camps for forced labor. The experience of Europe's Roma and Sinti population has parallels with that of the Jewish people. Both populations were targeted on the grounds of their race and had previously suffered centuries of discrimination. The Nuremberg laws, which prohibited marriage between Jews and Aryans and enshrined the loss of citizenship rights, were also applied to Roma and Sinti. As with Jewish children, Roma and Sinti children were banned from public schools and adults found it increasingly difficult to maintain or secure employment. Despite the genocide committed against Roma and Sinti people by the Nazi regime, their experiences were only fully recognized by the West German government in 1981, and the genocide is only now becoming more widely known. People. Many black people who lived in Germany under the Nazi regime were persecuted, alienated and murdered during this period. The Nazis viewed them as a threat to the purity of the Germanic race. Nazi propaganda posters, showing friendship across racial groups, referred to a loss of racial pride. Racist Nazi propaganda poster copyright USHMM. In the 1920s, around 24,000 black people were living in Germany. African German mixed-race children were economically and socially marginalized in German society, and not allowed to attend university. Under the Nazis, black people no longer had jobs and were excluded from many aspects of life. When the Nazis came to power, one of the first directives was aimed at mixed-race children. Underlining Hitler's obsession with racial purity, by 1937 every identified mixed-race child in the Rhineland had been forcibly sterilized, in order to prevent further race polluting, as Hitler termed it. Hans Haupt, a black survivor of Nazi racial policies and a victim of the sterilization program, explained in the film Hitler's Forgotten Victims that, when he was forced to undergo sterilization as a teenager, he was given no anesthetic. Once he received his sterilization certificate, he was free to go, as long as he agreed to have no sexual relations with Germans. Black prisoners of war. Prisoners of war, POWs, faced mistreatment at the hands of the Nazis, who did not uphold the regulations imposed by the Geneva Convention, the International Agreement on the Conduct of War and the Treatment of Wounded and Captured Soldiers. Black soldiers of the American, French, and British armies were worked to death on construction projects or died as a result of mistreatment in concentration or prisoner of war camps. Others were never even incarcerated, but were instead immediately killed by the SS or Gestapo. Black prisoners received harsher treatment and less food than white POWs, and whilst most white POWs were imprisoned, many of the black soldiers either worked until they died or were executed. Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau is the most infamous of all Nazi camps, and we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January, the date of its liberation by Soviet troops. Over 1.1 million people were murdered at this site, and over 90% of them were Jewish. Background. Inmates at Canada store sorting belongings of murdered Jews. Copyright Wiener Library. Auschwitz was built in the suburbs of Oświęcim, a city in the south of Nazi-occupied Poland, and Auschwitz is a Germanization of this city name. It was a network of several camps, combining forced labor and death camps. Auschwitz I featured the infamous sign over the gate, Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. This site was primarily made up of brick barracks and housed prisoners doing forced labor. Conditions were harsh and overcrowded, and prisoners were given meager rations of food. Many people starved to death. Auschwitz II is also known as Birkenau. This was where the majority of the killings took place, and where the crematoria were placed. Also on this site was a family camp, specifically for Roma and Sinti prisoners. Auschwitz III, also called Monowitz-Bühne, was an industrial complex of factories at which prisoners were used as slave labor. There were an additional 45 sub-camps around these sites. The history of Auschwitz. In late summer 1941, the Nazis began experimenting with a new killing method, a poison gas called Zyklon B. As the war progressed, Auschwitz-Birkenau was selected by the Nazis as the main killing site for European Jews, because of its location and access to the rail network. From this point on, increasingly larger poison gas chambers were constructed at the camp to kill people using Zyklon B. In 1942, Jews from across Europe began to be transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The peak of the slaughter occurred in 1944, when more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were killed in just 2 months. Arrival in the camp started with a selection process. Men, women and children were removed from the trains and had their valuables taken away. Men were separated from women and children. A Nazi physician would quickly assess whether each person was healthy enough to use for forced labor, and based on this visual inspection, individuals were sent to the camps or to the gas chambers. The disabled, elderly, pregnant women, babies, young children or the sick stood little chance of surviving this selection. Those who were selected for death were led to the gas chambers, and, in order to prevent panic, some victims were told they were going to the showers to remove the lice from their bodies. They were made to hand over any remaining valuables and remove all of their clothes. After being ushered into the gas chambers, the doors would be shut and bolted. The poison took up to 20 minutes to kill those in the chambers. Camp prisoners were then forced by the SS guards to remove the corpses from the chambers and to remove hair, gold teeth and fillings. The corpses were then burned in crematoria. Prisoners selected for forced labor had their clothes and belongings taken away, they were showered and had their heads shaved. They were given a striped uniform to wear and tattooed with an identification number. Prisoners were also classified with colored triangles on their uniforms, so Nazi officials could know if they were Jewish, Roma, homosexuals, asocials, political prisoners, etc. Life expectancy for forced laborers in Auschwitz was less than 6 months, due to starvation, disease and long days of hard physical work. Death marches and liberation. As Allied troops made progress across Nazi-occupied Europe, they began to uncover concentration and extermination camps. The camp of Majdanek in Poland was the first to be liberated, in the summer of 1944. Nazi forces burnt the crematoria and the mass graves in attempts to hide the crimes that had been committed. The camps of Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka were dismantled by the Nazis from 1943, and Auschwitz was evacuated in late 1944. The remaining prisoners from each camp were forced to walk from Poland to camps in Germany. Already suffering from starvation and ill treatment, and poorly clothed against elements, many thousands died on these enforced death marches. Soviet soldiers liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 27th of January 1945. They found several thousand emaciated survivors, and the smoldering remains of the gas chambers and crematoria. The Nazis attempt to destroy evidence of their crimes against humanity. In the following months, the Soviets liberated Stutthof, Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück. US troops liberated Buchenwald in April 1945, followed by Flossenburg, Dachau and Mauthausen. British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen on 15 April 1945. Liberator Iolo Lewis recalled the site that met the liberators. Diseases such as typhoid were rife, and an ever-present danger to the malnourished survivors. Many camps had to be burnt to the ground in order to ensure the containment of diseases. The liberation of the camps exposed the full extent of the Nazis' final solution to the rest of the world. Here, Bergen-Belsen, for most of those in the camps, liberation was a muted experience. They were alive, but they had lost everything. Thousands died of malnutrition and disease even after Allied troops arrived. Many people were so malnourished that their bodies could not cope with the food they were given. Rebuilding lives. After the Holocaust, those who survived often faced incomprehension and even hostility. People who went back to where they had previously lived frequently discovered that their homes were occupied by other people and that their belongings were gone. They were treated with fear and resentment. Jewish refugees from SS Exodus. Copyright Wiener Library. About 50,000 Jewish camp survivors gathered in the British and American zones of occupation in Germany, where they were housed in displaced persons camps, including one on the site of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Outbreaks of violent anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, in Poland led to over 100,000 Polish Jewish survivors joining the safe zones in Germany. But no country in the world was willing to take substantial numbers of Jewish, displaced persons, DIPs, as the survivors became known. The British government refused to allow an influx of Jewish refugees to Britain, and only a few thousand migrated under a scheme for the distressed relatives of Jews already in the UK. Britain was also responsible for administering Palestine, where the majority of DPs wished to emigrate to. The British government refused to allow Holocaust survivors to join the Jewish community in Palestine, until it withdrew from Palestine in 1948 and the State of Israel was founded. The British government ordered refugees attempting to sail to Palestine to be deported back to Germany. Few survivors received anything more than essential medical treatment. About 750 boys and girls who were brought to Britain by the British Jewish community were given excellent care and sustained attention, but they were the exception. Neither the survivors nor the liberating troops, many of whom were traumatized by what they had seen, received the kind of support that we would deem essential to their psychological well-being. In the post-war trials of war criminals, the testimony of survivors was almost totally ignored, and they were at the bottom of the list of those to get restitution. It took decades before they obtained justice. In Germany, Roma people and gay men had no chance of obtaining redress. The laws under which they had been persecuted remained in force for many years. Their experiences, like the Nazi treatment of black people, were hardly mentioned. The best-known Holocaust denier in the UK is David Irving. Despite not being trained as a historian, he has written numerous books about the history of the Second World War in which he expresses his pro-Nazi sympathies. He denies that the Nazi Germans murdered Jews in gas chambers, maintains close ties with the IHR, and testified in Zundel's defense. He has been fined in Germany for publicly denying the Holocaust and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in Austria. Nick Griffin, leader of the far-right British National Party, has expressed similar views. Robert Faurisson was banned from university teaching in France for denying the Holocaust. Holocaust deniers Albert Sabo and Istvan Gorkos are under judicial investigation in Hungary for Holocaust denial. A Pole University lecturer Dariusz Rataczak became the most notorious Holocaust denier in Poland. He was fired and brought to trial, but the court dismissed the case against him on the grounds of negligible social harmfulness. Among organizations in Poland that deny the Holocaust, the leader is the Polish National Rebirth, Narodowe Odrodzenie Polskie, publisher of the periodical Zabiec. The title refers to the coronation sword of the Polish kings. In issue 3/5, 1997, it published a translation of the IHR's 66 questions and answers. As for Auschwitz, it states that it was an internment center and part of a large-scale manufacturing complex. Synthetic fuel was produced there, and its inmates were used as a workforce. The characteristic attitude is mockery and sarcasm, vying with obsessive hatred of the victims who, in the case of Auschwitz, were not only Jews, but also Poles. Other nationalist organizations and individuals in Poland voice similar views. What impact does this propaganda have on wide-scale public opinion? The most vulnerable targets for such views are people who do not wish to accept historical co-responsibility for Nazi-era crimes. The people who supported fascism in Germany and other countries and who participated to various degrees in the functioning of the criminal apparatus of violence and extermination. This is a symptom of refusal to come to terms with history, to use the popular expression, or to overcome the past. In intergenerational terms, these people are passing on their views and attitudes to their biological and spiritual successors. Another group of people who approve Holocaust denial consists of those driven by anti-Semitic obsessions, extreme nationalists, and all sorts of proponents of the pre-war and wartime regimes that collaborated with the Third Reich. Also vulnerable to these views are groups of people that know history poorly or not at all, and who happen to come across revisionist propaganda by chance. On several occasions in recent years, the press has reported on instances of the acceptance of revisionist views. As a rule, these concern organizations and individuals who are well known because of their professional or social positions. In 1997, the press reported that one of the best-known German neo-Nazis, Manfred Roeder, was invited to lecture at the Bundeswehr Command Academy. There have been cases of far-right brochures being distributed in German barracks, and of soldiers exchanging the Nazi salute or reenacting the burning of Jews. On June 9, 2005, the Polish press reported that Austrian Senator John Gedenis had questioned the existence of the gas chambers on television. He later stated that there were no gas chambers in Germany, but that they did exist in Poland. In Wales, a police constable, Robert Pulling, told participants in a police academy training session that Hitler was right. The acceptance of revisionist claims or ignorance about the crimes committed by the German regime and the regimes that collaborated with Nazi Germany leads to the glorification of people and institutions responsible for genocide. In Slovakia, the president of the wartime Slovak Republic, who shared responsibility for the deportation of the Jews and their killing, is adored. Many aspects of the glorification of the Wehrmacht in Germany are objectionable, since the army cleared the path for the criminals in the SS and Gestapo, and itself participated on more than one occasion in executions of civilians and POWs. In many countries, despite the laws in force, there is a tendency to turn a blind eye on Holocaust negation and genocide in the name of a misguided concept of freedom of speech. In Poland, the controversial politician and journalist Janusz Korwin-Mikke, for instance, voices such opinions. While referring to Voltaire's maxim about defending the right to express even unpopular views, such people forget about the equally important political and moral aspects of genocide denial. In essence, this was not only the most tragic of human experiences, but also the most significant, not only in terms of the past, but also of the present and the future. Denying the Holocaust and genocide is also an affront to the victims. It strips those who died of their right to remembrance. For those who lost loved ones, it is a painful slander, a covert, or indeed an overt accusation that they are telling untruths. The best-known Holocaust denier in the UK is Holocaust Survivors and the Establishment of the State of Israel, May 14, 1948. Before the Holocaust, European Jews had endured many centuries of anti-Semitism. In the aftermath of this genocide, it became clear to many Holocaust survivors and other Jews that Jews needed their own country where they could live in safety and independence. Jewish responses to anti-Semitism in the decades before the Holocaust. Theodor Herzl and the First Zionist Congress. As a foreign correspondent for a leading Viennese newspaper, Herzl covered the anti-Semitic Dreyfus Affair in Paris in 1894. Creation of mandatory Palestine after World War I. The future of the Ottoman Empire and its territory was a point of discussion during the war. In the years following World War I, many political parties across Europe found that hateful anti-Jewish messages had broad appeal with voters. New political movements, including German Nazism, openly proclaimed anti-Semitic goals and adopted anti-Semitic party platforms. However, British authorities strictly limited Jewish immigration to mandatory Palestine. Seeking safe haven during the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945. It outlined British plans to further restrict Jewish immigration to mandatory Palestine. Mandatory Palestine during World War II, 1939 to 1945. The post-war refugee crisis, 1945 to 1948. In the Allied occupation zones in Western Europe, many Holocaust survivors were housed in refugee camps, called displaced persons, DP, camps. American and British debates about Jewish refugees. In the summer of 1945, the U.S. representative to the Intergovernmental Committee for Refugees, Earl G. Harrison, undertook a mission to determine the needs of Jewish and other non-repatriable DPs. Its April 1946 report confirmed Harrison's findings. Holocaust survivors and Zionism in the DP camps. From 1945 to 1948, Jewish survivors more and more often chose British-controlled mandatory Palestine as their most desired destination. The DPs became an influential force in the Zionist cause. From there, the Jewish Brigade Group led a network of groups organizing ships to bring DPs to mandatory Palestine without British permission. Holocaust survivors and the establishment of the State of Israel. This was a recommendation that Jewish leaders accepted and Arabs rejected.